Chapter 7a of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Don Bott, www.flacker.ca. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 7a. The living things that have come down to this earth. Attempts to preserve the system. That small frogs and toads, for instance, never have fallen from the sky but were on the ground in the first place. Or that there have been such falls, up from one place in a whirlwind and down in another. Were there some especially froggy place near Europe, as there is an especially sandy place, the scientific explanation would, of course, be that all small frogs falling from the sky in Europe come from that center of froggiety. To start with, I'd like to emphasize something that I am permitted to see because I am still primitive, or intelligent, or in a state of maladjustment. That there is not one report findable of a fall of tadpoles from the sky. As to there in the first place. See Leisure Hours 3-779 for accounts of small frogs or toads said to have been seen to fall from the sky. The writer says that all observers were mistaken, that the frogs or toads must have fallen from trees or other places overhead. Tremendous number of little toads, 1 or 2 months old, that were seen to fall from a great thick cloud that appeared suddenly in a sky that had been cloudless. August 1804, near Toulouse, France, according to a letter from Professor Pontus to M. Arago, Comptes Rendus 3-54. Many instances of frogs that were seen to fall from the sky. Notes and Queries 8-6-104. Accounts of such falls, signed by witnesses. Notes and Queries 8-6-190. Scientific American, July 12, 1873. A shower of frogs which darkened the air and covered the ground for a long distance is the reported result of a recent rainstorm at Kansas City, Missouri. As to having been there in the first place, little frogs found in London after a heavy storm, July 30th, 1838. Notes and Queries 8-7-437. Little toads found in a desert after a rainfall. Notes and Queries 8-8-493. To start with, I do not deny positively the conventional explanation of up and down. I think that there may have been such occurrences. I omit many notes that I have upon indistinguishables. In the London Times, July 4th, 1883, there is an account of a shower of twigs and leaves and tiny toads in a storm upon the slopes of the Apennines. These may have been the ejectamenta of a whirlwind. I add, however, that I have notes upon 2 other falls of tiny toads in 1883, one in France and one in Tahiti. Also, a fish in Scotland. But in the phenomena of the Apennines, the mixture seems to me to be typical of the products of a whirlwind. The other instances seem to me to be typical of something like migration, the great numbers and their homogeneity. Over and over in these annals of the damned occurs the datum of segregation. But a whirlwind is thought of as a condition of chaos, quasi-chaos, not final negativeness, of course. Monthly Weather Review, July, 1881. A small pond in the track of the cloud was sucked dry, the water being carried over the adjoining fields together with a large quantity of soft mud, which was scattered over the ground for half a mile around. It is so easy to say that small frogs that have fallen from the sky had been scooped up by a whirlwind. But here are the circumstances of a scoop. In the exclusionist imagination, there is no regard for mud, debris from the bottom of a pond, floating vegetation, loose things from the shores, but a precise picking out of frogs only. Of all instances I have that attribute the fall of small frogs or toads to whirlwinds, only one definitely identifies or places the whirlwind. Also, as has been said before, a pond going up would be quite as interesting as frogs coming down. Whirlwinds we read of over and over, but where, and what whirlwind? It seems to me that anybody who had lost a pond would be heard from. In Simon's Meteorological Magazine, 32-106, a fall of small frogs near Birmingham, England, June 30th, 1892, is attributed to a specific whirlwind. but not a word as to any special pond that had contributed. And something that strikes my attention here is that these frogs are described as almost white. I'm afraid there is no escape for us. We shall have to give to civilization upon this earth some new worlds. Places with white frogs in them. Upon several occasions we have had data of unknown things that have fallen from somewhere. But something not to be overlooked is that if living things have landed alive upon this earth, in spite of all we think we know of the accelerative velocity of falling bodies, and have propagated, why, the exotic becomes the indigenous, or, from the strangest of places, we'd expect the familiar. Or, if hosts of living frogs have come here, from somewhere else, every living thing upon this earth may, ancestrally, have come from somewhere else. I find that I have another note upon a specific hurricane. Annals and Magazine of Natural History 1-3-185. After one of the greatest hurricanes in the history of Ireland, some fish were found as far as 15 yards from the edge of a lake. Have another. This is a good one for the exclusionists. Fall of fish in Paris. Said that a neighboring pond had been blown dry. Living age 52-186. Date not given, but I have seen it recorded somewhere else. The best known fall of fishes from the sky is that which occurred at Mountain Ash in the valley of Aberdare, Glamorganshire, February 11th, 1859. The editor of the Zoologist 2-677, having published a report of a fall of fishes, writes, "I am continually receiving similar accounts of frogs and fishes. But, in all the volumes of the Zoologist, I can find only 2 reports of such falls. There is nothing to conclude other than that hosts of data have been lost because orthodoxy does not look favorably upon such reports. The Monthly Weather Review records several falls of fishes in the United States, but accounts of these reported occurrences are not findable in other American publications." Nevertheless, the treatment by the zoologist of the fall reported from Mountain Ash is fair. First appears, in the issue of 1859-6493, a letter from the Reverend John Griffith, vicar of Aberdare, asserting that the fall had occurred chiefly upon the property of Mr. Nixon of Mountain Ash. Upon page 6540, Dr. Gray, of the British Museum, bristling with exclusionism, writes that some of these fishes, which had been sent to him alive, were very young minnows. He says, "On reading the evidence, it seems to me most probably only a practical joke, that one of Mr. Nixon's employees had thrown a pailful of water upon another who had thought fish in it had fallen from the sky, had dipped up a pailful from a brook. Those fishes, still alive, were exhibited at the Zoological Gardens, Regent's Park. The editor says that one was a minnow and that the rest were sticklebacks." He says that Dr. Gray's explanation is no doubt right. But, upon page 6564, he publishes a letter from another correspondent who apologizes for opposing so high an authority as Dr. Gray, but says that he had obtained some of these fishes from persons who lived at a considerable distance apart or considerably out of range of the playful pail of water. According to the Annual Register, 1859-14, the fishes themselves had fallen by pailfuls. If these fishes were not upon the ground in the first place, we base our objections to the whirlwind explanation upon 2 data. That they fell in no such distribution as one could attribute to the discharge of a whirlwind, but upon a narrow strip of land, about 80 yards long and 12 yards wide. The other datum is again the suggestion that at first seemed so incredible, but for which support is piling up, a suggestion of a stationary source overhead. That 10 minutes later, another fall of fishes occurred upon this same narrow strip of land. Even arguing that a whirlwind may stand still axially, it discharges tangentially. Wherever the fishes came from, it does not seem thinkable that some could have fallen and that others could have whirled even a tenth of a minute, then falling directly after the first to fall. Because of these evil circumstances, the best adaptation was to laugh the whole thing off and say that someone had soused someone else with a pailful of water in which a few very young minnows had been caught up. In the London Times, March 2nd, 1859, is a letter from Mr. Aaron Roberts, curate of St. Peter's, Carmathon. In this letter, the fishes are said to have been about 4 inches long, but there is some question of species. I think, myself, that they were minnows and sticklebacks. Some persons, thinking them to be sea fishes, placed them in salt water, according to Mr. Roberts. The effect is stated to have been almost instantaneous death. Some were placed in fresh water. These seemed to thrive well. As to narrow distribution, we are told that the fishes fell in and about the premises of Mr. Nixon. It was not observed at the time that any fish fell in any other part of the neighborhood, save in the particular spot mentioned. In the London Times, March 10, 1859, Victor Griffith writes an account. The roofs of some houses were covered with them. In this letter it is said that the largest fishes were 5 inches long, and that these did not survive the fall. Report of the British Association, 1859-158. The evidence of the fall of fish on this occasion was very conclusive. A specimen of the fish was exhibited and was found to be Gasterosteus lyris. Gasterosteus is the stickleback. Altogether, I think we have not a sense of total perdition, when we're damned with the explanation that someone soused someone else with a pailful of water in which were thousands of fishes 4 or 5 inches long, some of which covered roofs of houses and some of which remained 10 minutes in the air. By way of contrast, we offer our own acceptance, that the bottom of a super-geographical pond had dropped out. I have a great many notes upon the fall of fishes, despite the difficulty these records have in getting themselves published, but I pick out the instances that especially relate to our super-geographical acceptances, or to the principles of supergeography, or data of things that have been in the air longer than acceptably could a whirlwind carry them, that have fallen with a distribution narrower than is attributable to a whirlwind, that have fallen for a considerable length of time upon the same narrow area of land. These 3 factors indicate, somewhere not far aloft, a region of inertness to this earth's gravitation, of course. However, a region that, by the flux and variation of all things, must at times be susceptible. But afterward, our heresy will bifurcate. In amiable accommodation to the crucifixion it'll get, I think. But so impressed are we with the datum that, though there have been many reports of small frogs that have fallen from the sky, not one report upon a fall of tadpoles is findable, that to these circumstances another adjustment must be made. Apart from our 3 factors of indication, an extraordinary observation is the fall of living things without injury to them. The devotees of St. Isaac explain that they fall upon thick grass and so survive. But Sir James Emerson Tennant, in his History of Ceylon, tells of a fall of fishes upon gravel by which they were seemingly uninjured. Something else apart from our 3 main interests is a phenomena that looks like what one might call an alternating series of falls of fishes, whatever the significance may be. Meerut, India, July 1824. Living age 52-186. Fifeshire, Scotland, summer of 1824. Wernerian Natural History Society Translations 5-575. Moradabad, India, July 1826. Living age 52-186. Rossshire, Scotland, 1828. Living age 52-186. Moradabad, India, July 20th, 1829. Lynn Society Translations 16-764. Perthshire, Scotland, living age 52-186. Argyllshire, Scotland, 1830, March 9th, 1830. Recreative Science 3-339. Faridpur, India, February 19th, 1830. Journal Asiatic Society of Bengal 2-650. A psychotropism that arises here, disregarding serial significance, or mechanical, unintelligent, repulsive reflex, is that the fishes of India did not fall from the sky, that they were found upon the ground after torrential rains, because streams had overflowed and had then receded. In the region of inertness that we think we can conceive of, or a zone that is to this earth's gravitation very much like the neutral zone of a magnet's attraction, We accept that there are bodies of water and also clear spaces, bottoms of ponds dropping out, very interesting ponds having no earth at bottom, vast drops of water afloat in what is called space, fishes and deluges of water falling. But also other areas in which fishes, however they got there, a matter that we'll consider, remain and dry, or even putrefy, then sometimes falling by atmospheric dislodgement. After a tremendous deluge of rain, one of the heaviest falls on record, all the year round, 8-255, at Rajkote, India, July 25, 1850, the ground was literally covered with fishes. The word found is agreeable to the repulsions of the conventionalists and their concept of an overflowing stream. But, according to Dr. Buist, some of these fishes were found on the tops of haystacks. Farrell, a popular treatise, page 414, tells of a fall of living fishes, some of them having been placed in a tank where they survived, that occurred in India about 20 miles south of Calcutta, September 20th, 1839. A witness of this fall says, "The most strange thing which ever struck me was that the fish did not fall helter-skelter, or here and there, but they fell in a straight line, not more than a cubit in breadth." See Living Age, 52-186. American Journal of Science, 1/32/199. That, according to testimony taken before a magistrate, a fall occurred February 19th, 1830, near Faridpur, India, of many fishes of various sizes, some whole and fresh, and others mutilated and putrefying. Our reflex to those who would say that, in the climate of India, it would not take long for fishes to putrefy is, that high in the air, the climate of India is not torrid. Another peculiarity of this fall is that some of the fishes were much larger than others, or to those who hold out for segregation in a whirlwind, or that objects, say, twice as heavy as others would be separated from the lighter, we point out that some of these fishes were twice as heavy as others. In the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, 2-650, depositions of witnesses are given. Some of the fish were fresh, but others were rotten and without heads. Among the number which I got, 5 were fresh, and the rest stinking and headless. They remind us of His Grace's observation of some pages back. According to Dr. Buist, some of these fishes weighed 1½ pounds each, and others 3 pounds. A fall of fishes at Futtapore, India, May 16th, 1833. They were all dead and dry. Dr. Buist, Living Age, 52-186. India is far away. About 1830 was long ago. Nature, September 19th, 1918-46. A correspondent writes from the Dove Marine Laboratory, Cuttercoats, England, that at Hindon, a suburb of Sunderland, August 24, 1918, hundreds of small fishes identified as sand eels had fallen. Again the small area, about 60 by 30 yards. The fall occurred during a heavy rain that was accompanied by thunder, or indications of disturbances aloft, but by no visible lightning. The sea is close to Hindon, but if you try to think of these fishes having described a trajectory in a whirlwind from the ocean, consider this remarkable datum: that, according to witnesses, the fall upon this small area occupied 10 minutes. I cannot think of a clearer indication of a direct fall from a stationary source. And the fish were all dead and indeed stiff and hard when picked up, immediately after the occurrence. By all of which I mean that we have only begun to pile up our data of things that fall from a stationary source overhead. We'll have to take up the subject from many approaches before our acceptance, which seems quite as rigorously arrived at as ever has been a belief, can emerge from the accursed. I don't know how much the horse in the barn will help us to emerge, but if ever anything did go up from this earth's surface and stay up, those damn things may have. Monthly Weather Review, May 1878. In a tornado in Wisconsin, May 23, 1878. A barn and a horse were carried completely away, and neither horse nor barn nor any portion of either have since been found. After that, which would be a little strong were it not for a steady improvement in our digestions that I note as we go along, There is little of the bizarre or the unassimilable in the turtle that hovered 6 months or so over a small town in Mississippi. Monthly Weather Review, May, 1894. That, May 11th, 1894, at Vicksburg, Mississippi, fell a small piece of alabaster that, at Bovina, 8 miles from Vicksburg, fell a gopher turtle. They fell in a hailstorm. This item was widely copied at the time. For instance, Nature, one of the volumes of 1894, page 430, and Journal of the Royal Metropolitan Society, 20-273. As to discussion, not a word. Or science and its continuity with Presbyterianism, data like this are damned at birth. The Weather Review does sprinkle, or baptize, or attempt to save this infant. But in all the meteorological literature that I have gone through, after that date, not a word, except mention once or twice. The editor of the review says, "An examination of the weather map shows that these hailstorms occur on the south side of a region of cold northerly winds, and were but a small part of a series of similar storms. Apparently, some special local whirls or gusts carried heavy objects from the earth's surface up to the cloud regions." Of all incredibilities that we have to choose from, I give first place to a notion of a whirlwind pouncing upon a region and scrupulously selecting a turtle and a piece of alabaster. This time, the other mechanical thing, there in the first place, cannot rise in response to its stimulus. It is resisted in that these objects were coated with ice. Month of May in a southern state. If a whirlwind at all, there must have been very limited selection. There is no record of the fall of other objects. But there is no attempt in the review to specify a whirlwind. These strangely associated things were remarkably separated. They fell 8 miles apart. Then, as if there were real reasoning, they must have been high to fall with such divergence, or one of them must have been carried partly horizontally 8 miles farther than the other. But either supposition argues for power more than that of a local whirl or gust, or argues for a great, specific disturbance of which there is no record, for the month of May, 1894. Nevertheless, as if I really were reasonable, I do feel that I have to accept that this turtle had been raised from the earth's surface somewhere near Vicksburg, because the gopher turtle is common in the southern states. End of Chapter 7a. Recording by Don Bott, www.flacker.ca. Chapter 7b of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Don Bott, www.flacker.ca. The Book of the Damned, by Charles Fort, Chapter 7b. Then I think of a hurricane that occurred in the state of Mississippi weeks or months before May 11th, 1894. No, I don't look for it, and inevitably find it. Or that things can go up so high in hurricanes that they stay up indefinitely, but may, after a while, be shaken down by storms. Over and over we have noted the occurrence of strange falls in storms. So then that the turtle and the piece of alabaster may have had far different origins, from different worlds perhaps, have entered a region of suspension over this earth, wafting near each other, long duration, final precipitation by atmospheric disturbance, with hail, or that hailstones too, when large, are phenomena of suspension of long duration. That it is highly unacceptable that the very large ones could become so great only in falling from the clouds. Over and over has the note of disagreeableness or of putrefaction been struck. Long duration. Other indications of long duration. I think of a region somewhere above this earth's surface in which gravitation is inoperative and is not governed by the square of the distance, quite as magnetism is negligible at a very short distance from a magnet. Theoretically, the attraction of a magnet should decrease with the square of the distance, but the falling off is found to be almost abrupt at a short distance. I think that things raised from this earth's surface to that region have been held there until shaken down by storms. The Super Sargasso Sea. Derelicts, rubbish, old cargoes from interplanetary wrecks, things cast out into what is called space by convulsions of other planets, things from the times of the Alexanders, Caesars, and Napoleons, of Mars and Jupiter and Neptune, things raised by this earth's cyclones, horses and barns and elephants and flies and dodos, moas and pterodactyls, leaves from modern trees and leaves of the Carboniferous era, all, however, tending to disintegrate into homogeneous-looking muds or dusts, red or black or yellow, treasure troves for the paleontologists and for the archaeologists, accumulations of centuries, cyclones of Egypt, Greece, and Assyria, fishes dried and hard, there a short time, others there long enough to putrefy. But the omnipresence of heterogeneity, or living fishes also, ponds of fresh water, oceans of salt water. As to the law of gravitation, I prefer to take one simple stand. Orthodoxy accepts the correlation and equivalence of forces. Gravitation is one of these forces. All other forces have phenomena of repulsion and of inertness irrespective of distance as well as of attraction. But Newtonian gravitation admits attraction only. Then Newtonian gravitation can be only one-third acceptable, even to the orthodox, or there is denial of the correlation and equivalence of forces. Or still simpler, here are the data. Make what you will, yourself, of them. In our intermediatist revolt against homogeneous or positive explanations, or our acceptance that the all-sufficing cannot be less than universality, besides which, however, there would be nothing to suffice, our expressions upon the Super Sargasso Sea, though it harmonizes with data of fishes that fall as if from a stationary source, and, of course, with other data, too, is inadequate to account for two peculiarities of the fall of frogs: that never has a fall of tadpoles been reported, that never has a fall of full-grown frogs been reported, always frogs a few months old. It sounds positive, but if there be such reports, they are somewhere out of my range of reading. But tadpoles would be more likely to fall from the sky than would frogs, little or big, if such falls be attributed to whirlwinds, and more likely to fall from the Super Sargasso Sea if, though very tentatively and provisionally, we accept the Super Sargasso Sea. Before we take up an especial expression upon the fall of immature and larval forms of life to this earth, and the necessity then of conceiving of some factor besides mere stationariness, or suspension, or stagnation, there are other data that are similar to data of falls of fishes. Science Gossip, 1886-238. That small snails, of a land species, had fallen near Redruth, Cornwall, July 8, 1886, during a heavy thunderstorm. Roads and fields strewn with them, so that they were gathered up by the hatful. None seen to fall by the writer of this account. Snails said to be quite different to any previously known in this district. But, upon page 282, we have better orthodoxy. Another correspondent writes that he had heard of the supposed fall of snails, that he had supposed that all such stories had gone the way of witch stories, that, to his astonishment, he had read an account of this absurd story in a local newspaper of great and deserved repute. I thought I should for once like to trace the origin of one of these fabulous tales. Our own acceptance is that justice cannot be in an intermediate existence, in which there can be approximation only to justice or to injustice, that to be fair is to have no opinion at all, that to be honest is to be uninterested, that to investigate is to admit prejudice, that nobody has ever really investigated anything, but has always sought positively to prove or to disprove something that was conceived of or suspected in advance. As I suspected, says this correspondent, I found that the snails were of a familiar land species, that they had been upon the ground in the first place. He found that the snails had appeared after the rain, that astonished rustics had jumped to the conclusion that they had fallen. He met one person who said that he had seen the snails fall. This was his error, says the investigator. In the Philosophical Magazine, 58-310, there is an account of snails said to have fallen at Bristol in a field of 3 acres, in such quantities that they were shoveled up. It is said that the snails may be considered as a local species. Upon page 457, another correspondent says that the numbers had been exaggerated, and that in his opinion they had been upon the ground in the first place, but that there had been some unusual condition aloft comes out in his observation upon the curious azure blue appearance of the sun at the time. Nature 47-278. That, according to Das Wetter, December 1892, upon August 9, 1892, a yellow cloud appeared over Paderborn, Germany. From this cloud fell a torrential rain, in which were hundreds of mussels. There is no mention of whatever may have been upon the ground in the first place, nor of a whirlwind. Lizards, said to have fallen on the sidewalks of Montreal, Canada, December 28, 1857. Notes and Queries 8-6-104. In the Scientific American 3-112, a correspondent writes from South Granville, New York, that, during a heavy shower, July 3, 1860, he heard a peculiar sound at his feet, and looking down saw a snake lying as if stunned by a fall. It then came to life. Gray snake, about a foot long. These data have any meaning or lack of meaning or degree of damnation you please. But, in the matter of the fall that occurred at Memphis, Tennessee, occur some strong significances. Our quasi-reasoning upon this subject applies to all segregation so far considered. Monthly Weather Review, January 15, 1877. That, in Memphis, Tennessee, January 15, 1877, rather strictly localized or, in a space of 2 blocks, and after a violent storm in which the rain fell in torrents, snakes were found. They were crawling on sidewalks, in yards, and in streets, and in masses, but none were found on roofs or any other elevation above ground, and none were seen to fall. If you prefer to believe that the snakes had always been there, or had been upon the ground in the first place, and that it was only that something occurred to call special attention to them, in the streets of Memphis, January 15, 1877, why, that's sensible. That's the common sense that has been against us from the first. It is not said whether the snakes were of a known species or not, but that, when first seen, they were of a dark brown, almost black. Black snakes, I suppose. If we accept that these snakes did fall, even though not seen to fall by all the persons who were out sightseeing in a violent storm, and had not been in the streets crawling loose or in thick tangled masses in the first place, if we try to accept that these snakes had been raised from some other part of this earth's surface in a whirlwind, if we try to accept that a whirlwind could segregate them, if we accept the segregation of other objects raised in that whirlwind, then, near the place of origin, there would have been a fall of heavier objects that had been snatched up with the snakes, stones, fence rails, limbs of trees. Say that the snakes occupied the next gradation, and would be the next to fall. Still farther would there have been separate falls of lightest objects, leaves, twigs, tufts of grass. In the Monthly Weather Review, there is no mention of other falls said to have occurred anywhere in January 1877. Again, ours is the objection against such selectiveness by a whirlwind. Conceivably, a whirlwind could scoop out a den of hibernating snakes, with stones and earth and an infinitude of other debris, snatching up dozens of snakes. I don't know how many to a den, hundreds maybe. But, according to the account of this occurrence in the New York Times, there were thousands of them, alive, from 1 foot to 18 inches in length. The Scientific American 36-86 records the fall and says that there were thousands of them. The usual whirlwind explanation is given, but in what locality snakes exist in such abundance is yet a mystery. This matter of enormousness of numbers suggests to me something of a migratory nature, but that snakes in the United States do not migrate in the month of January, if ever. As to falls or flutterings of winged insects from the sky, prevailing notions of swarming would seem explanatory enough. Nevertheless, in instances of ants, there are some peculiar circumstances. L'Astronomie, 1889-353. Fall of fishes, June 13th, 1889, in Holland. Ants, August 1st, 1889, Strasbourg. Little toads, August 2nd, 1889, Savoy. Fall of ants, Cambridge, England, summer of 1874. Some were wingless. Scientific American 30-193. Enormous fall of ants, Nancy, France, July 21st, 1887. Most of them were wingless. Nature 36-349. Fall of enormous unknown ants, size of wasps, Manitoba, June 1895, Scientific American 72-385. However, our expression will be that wingless larval forms of life, in numbers so enormous that migration from some place external to this earth is suggested, have fallen from the sky. That these migrations, if such can be our acceptance, have occurred at a time of hibernation and burial far in the ground of larvae in the northern latitudes of this earth, that there is significance in recurrence of these falls in the last of January, or that we have the square of an incredibility in such a notion as that of selection of larvae by whirlwinds compounded with selection of the last of January. I accept that there are snow worms upon this earth, whatever their origin may have been. In the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia, 1899-125, there is a description of yellow worms and black worms that have been found together on glaciers in Alaska. Almost positively were there no other forms of insect life upon these glaciers, and there was no vegetation to support insect life, except microscopic organisms. Nevertheless, the description of this probably polymorphic species fits a description of larvae said to have fallen in Switzerland, and less definitely fits another description. There is no opposition here, if our data of falls are clear. Frogs of everyday ponds look like frogs said to have fallen from the sky, except the whitish frogs of Birmingham. However, all falls of larvae have not positively occurred in the last of January. London Times, April 14, 1837. That, in the parish of Bramford Speke, Devonshire, a long number of black worms, about 3/4 of an inch in length, had fallen in a snowstorm. In Times Yearbook, 1877-26, it is said that, in the winter of 1876, at Christiania, Norway, worms were found crawling upon the ground. The occurrence is considered a great mystery because the worms could not have come up from the ground, inasmuch as the ground was frozen at the time, and because they were reported from other places also in Norway. Immense number of black insects in a snowstorm in 1827 at Pakroff, Russia. Scientific American 30-193. Fall, with snow, at Orenburg, Russia, December 14, 1830, of a multitude of small black insects said to have been gnats, but also said to have had flea-like motions. American Journal of Science, 1-22-375. Large number of worms found in a snowstorm upon the surface of snow about 4 inches thick, near Sangerfield, New York, November 18, 1850. Scientific American, 6-96. The writer thinks that the worms had been brought to the surface of the ground by rain which had fallen previously. Scientific American, February 21, 1891. A puzzling phenomena has been noted frequently in some parts of the Valley Bend district, Randolph County, Virginia, this winter. The crust of the snow has been covered 2 or 3 times with worms resembling the ordinary cutworms. Where they come from, unless they fall with the snow, is inexplicable. In the Scientific American, March 7, 1891, the editor says that similar worms had been seen upon the snow near Utica, New York, and in Oneida and Herkimer counties. That some of the worms had been sent to the Department of Agriculture at Washington. Again, 2 species, or polymorphism. According to Professor Riley, it was not polymorphism, but 2 distinct species, which, because of our data, we doubt. One kind was larger than the other, color differences not distinctly stated. One is called the larvae of the common soldier beetle, and the other seems to be a variety of the bronze cutworm. No attempt to explain the occurrence in snow. Fall of great numbers of larvae of beetles near Mortagne, France, May 1858. The larvae were inanimate as if with cold. Annales Société Entomologique de France, 1858. Society of London, 1871-183 records, snowing of larvae in Silesia, 1806. Appearance of many larvae on the snow in Saxony, 1811. Larvae found alive on the snow, 1828. Larvae in snow which fell together in the Eifel, January 30, 1847. Fall of insects, January 24, 1849, in Lithuania. Occurrence of larvae estimated at 300,000 on the snow in Switzerland in 1856. The compiler says that most of these larvae live underground or at the roots of trees, that whirlwinds uproot trees and carry away the larvae, conceiving of them as not held in masses of frozen earth, all as neatly detachable as currents in something. In the Revue et Magazine de Zoologie, 1849-72, there is an account of the fall in Lithuania, January 24, 1849, that black larvae had fallen in enormous numbers. Larvae thought to have been of beetles, but described as caterpillars, not seen to fall, but found crawling on the snow after a snowstorm at Warsaw, January 20, 1850. All year round, 8-253. Flammarion, The Atmosphere, page 414, tells of a fall of larvae that occurred in January 30, 1869, in a snowstorm in Upper Savoy. They could not have been hatched in the neighborhood, for, during the days preceding, the temperature had been very low. Said to have been of a species common in the south of France. In La Science pour tout, 14-183, it is said that with these larvae there were developed insects. L'Astronomie, 1890-313. That, upon the last of January, 1890, there fell in a great tempest in Switzerland incalculable numbers of larvae, some black and some yellow, numbers so great that hosts of birds were attracted. Altogether, we regard this as one of our neatest expressions for external origins and against the whirlwind explanation. If an exclusionist says that, in January, larvae were precisely and painstakingly picked out of frozen ground, in incalculable numbers, he thinks of a tremendous force, disregarding its refinements. Then, if origin and precipitation be not far apart, what becomes of an infinitude of other debris, conceiving of no time for segregation? If he thinks of a long translation, all the way from the south of France to Upper Savoy, he may think then of a very fine sorting over by differences of specific gravity. But in such a fine selection, larvae would be separated from developed insects. As to differences in specific gravity, the yellow larvae that fell in Switzerland, January 1890, were 3 times the size of the black larvae that fell with them. In accounts of this occurrence, there is no denial of the fall, or that a whirlwind never brought them together and held them together and precipitated them and only them together, that they came from Genesistrine. There's no escape from it. We'll be persecuted for it, take it or leave it. Genesistrine. The notion that there is somewhere aloft a place of origin of life relatively to this earth, whether it's the planet Genesistrine, or the moon, or a vast amorphous region superjacent to this earth, or an island in the super Sargasso Sea, should perhaps be left to the researchers of other super, or extra, geographers. That the first unicellular organisms may have come here from Genesistrine, or that men or anthropomorphic beings may have come here before amoebae. That upon Genesistrine there may have been an evolution expressible in conventional biologic terms, but that evolution upon this earth has been, like evolution in modern Japan, induced by external influences. That evolution as a whole upon this earth has been a process of population by immigration or by bombardment. Some notes I have upon remains of men and animals encysted, or covered with clay or stone, as if fired here as projectiles, I omit now, because it seems best to regard the whole phenomena as a tropism, as a geotropism, probably atavistic or vestigial, as it were, or something still continuing long after expiration of necessity. That, once upon a time, all kinds of things came here from Genesistrine, but that now only a few kinds of bugs and things, at long intervals, feel the inspiration. Not one instance have we of tadpoles that have fallen to this earth. It seems reasonable that a whirlwind could scoop up a pond, frogs and all, and cast down the frogs somewhere else. But then more reasonable that a whirlwind could scoop up a pond, tadpoles and all, because tadpoles are more numerous in their season than are frogs in theirs. But the tadpole season is earlier in the spring, or in a time that is more tempestuous. Thinking in terms of causation, as if there were real causes, our notion is that if X is likely to cause Y, but is more likely to cause Z, but does not cause Z, X is not the cause of Y. Upon this quasi-sorte, we base our acceptance that the little frogs that have fallen to this earth are not products of whirlwinds, that they came from externality or from genesistrine. I think of genesistrine in terms of biologic mechanics. Not that somewhere there are persons who collect bugs in or about the last of January, and frogs in July and August, and bombard this earth any more than do persons go through northern regions, catching and collecting birds every autumn, and then casting them southward. But atavistic or vestigial geotropism in genesistrine, or a million larvae start crawling and a million little frogs start hopping, knowing no more what it's all about than we do when we crawl to work in the morning and hop away at night. I should say, myself, that genesistrine is a region in the Super Sargasso Sea, and that parts of the Super Sargasso Sea have rhythms of susceptibility to this Earth's attraction. End of Chapter 7b. Recording by Don Bott, www.flacker.ca.
8a of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Acacia Wood. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 8a. I accept that when there are storms, the damnedness of excluded, excommunicated things, things that are leprous to the faithful, are brought down from the Super Sargasso Sea, or from what, for convenience, we call the Super Sargasso Sea, which by no means has been taken into full acceptance yet. That things are brought down by storms, just as, from the depths of the sea, things are brought up by storms. To be sure, it is orthodoxy that storms have little, if any, effect below the waves of the ocean, but, of course, only to have an opinion is to be ignorant of or to disregard a contradiction or something else that modifies an opinion out of distinguishability. Symons' Meteorological Magazine, 47 180. That along the coast of New Zealand, in regions not subject to submarine volcanic action, deep-sea fishes are often brought up by storms. Iron and stones that fall from the sky and atmospheric disturbances. There is absolutely no connection between the two phenomena. Symons' Meteorological Magazine. The orthodox belief is that objects moving at planetary velocity would, upon entering this Earth's atmosphere, be virtually unaffected by hurricanes. Might as well think of a bullet swerved by someone fanning himself. The only trouble with the orthodox reasoning is the usual trouble. It's phantom dominant. It's basing upon a myth. Data we've had, and more we'll have, of things in the sky having no independent velocity. There are so many storms and so many meteors and meteorites that it would be extraordinary if there were no concurrences. Nevertheless, so many of these concurrences are listed by Professor Baden-Powell, Report of the British Association, 1850-54, that no one notices. See the Report of the British Association, 1860. Other instances: the famous fall of stones at Siena, Italy, 1794, in a violent storm. See Gregg's catalogues, many instances. One that stands out is bright ball of fire and light in a hurricane in England, September 2nd, 1786. The remarkable datum here is that this phenomenon was visible 40 minutes. That's about 800 times the duration that the orthodox give to meteors and meteorites. See the Annual Register, many instances. In Nature, October 25th, 1877, and the London Times, October 15th, 1877, something that fell in a gale of October 14th, 1877, is described as a huge ball of green fire. This phenomenon is described by another correspondent in Nature, 1710, and an account of it by another correspondent was forwarded to Nature by W.F. Denning. There are so many instances that some of us will revolt against the insistence of the faithful that it is only coincidence, and accept that there is connection of the kind called causal. If it is too difficult to think of stones and metallic masses swerved from their courses by storms, if they move at high velocity, we think of low velocity, or of things having no velocity at all, hovering a few miles above this earth, dislodged by storms, and falling luminously. But the resistance is so great here, and coincidence so insisted described in the monthly weather review. Have some more March, instances. 1886. Air light meteorite in a thunderstorm off coast of Greece, England, November 19, 1899. Nature, no trace 61-111. Register 1885. Fall of a meteorite in a storm, meteorite, July 7, 1883, near Lachine, Quebec. Monthly weather review, July 1883. Same phenomenon noted in Nature, 28-319. Meteorite in a whirlwind, Sweden, September 24, 1883. Nature, 29-15. London Royal Society Proceedings, 6-276. A triangular cloud that appeared in a storm, December 17, 1852. A red nucleus, about half the apparent diameter of the moon, and a long tail, visible 13 minutes, explosion of the nucleus. Nevertheless, in Science Gossip, NS 665, it is said that, though meteorites have fallen in storms, no connection is supposed to exist between the two phenomena, except by the ignorant peasantry. But some of us peasants have gone through the report of the British Association, 1852. Upon page 239, Dr. Buist, who had never heard of the Super Sargasso Sea, says that, though it is difficult to trace connection between the phenomena, 3 aerolites had fallen in 5 months in India during thunderstorms in 1851, may have been 1852. For accounts by witnesses, see page 229 of the report. Or, we are on our way to account for Thunderstones. It seems to me that, very strikingly here, is borne out the general acceptance that ours is only an intermediate existence, in which there is nothing fundamental or nothing final to take as a positive standard to judge by. Peasants believed in meteorites. Scientists excluded meteorites. Peasants believe in thunderstones. Scientists exclude thunderstones. It is useless to argue that peasants are out in the fields and that scientists are shut up in laboratories and lecture rooms. We cannot take for a real base that, as to phenomena that which they are more familiar, peasants are more likely to be right than are scientists. A host of biologic and meteorologic fallacies of peasants rises against us. I should say that our existence is like a bridge, except that that comparison is in static terms, but like the Brooklyn Bridge, upon which multitudes of bugs are seeking a fundamental, coming to a girder that seems firm and final, but the girder is built upon supports, a support that seems final, but it is built upon underlying structures. Nothing final can be found in all the bridge, because the bridge itself is not a final thing in itself, but is a relationship between Manhattan and Brooklyn. If our existence is a relationship between the positive absolute and the negative absolute, the quest for finality in it is hopeless. Everything in it must be relative, if the whole is not a whole, but is itself a relation. In the attitude of acceptance, our pseudo-base is, cells of an embryo are in the reptilian era of the embryo. Some cells feel stimuli to take on new appearances. If it be of the design of the whole that the next era be mammalian, those cells that turn mammalian will be sustained against resistance, by inertia of all the rest, and will be relatively right, though not finally right, because they too, in time, will have to give way to characters of other eras of higher development. If we are upon the verge of a new era, in which exclusionism must be overthrown, it will avail thee not to call us base-born and frowsy peasants. In our crude, bucolic way, we now offer an outrage upon common sense that we think will some day be an unquestioned commonplace: that manufactured objects of stone and iron have fallen from the sky, that they have been brought down from a state of suspension in a region of inertness to this earth's attraction by atmospheric disturbances. The thunderstone is usually a beautifully polished, wedge-shaped piece of greenstone, says a writer in the Cornhill Magazine, 50-517. It isn't. It's likely to be of almost any kind of stone, but we call attention to the skill with which some of them have been made. Of course, this writer says it's all superstition, otherwise he'd be one of us crude and simple sons of the soil. Conventional damnation is that stone implements already on the ground in the first place, are found near where lightning was seen to strike. that are supposed by astonished rustics, or by intelligence of a low order, to have fallen in or with lightning. Throughout this book we class a great deal of science with bad fiction. When is fiction bad, cheap, low? If coincidence is overworked. That's one way of deciding. But when single writers coincide seldom is overworked, we find the excess in the subject at large. Such a writer as the one of the Cornhill Magazine tells us vaguely of beliefs of peasants. There is no massing of instance after instance after instance. Here ours will be the method of mass formation. Conceivably, lightning may strike the ground near where there was a wedge-shaped object in the first place. Again, and again, and again. Lightning striking ground near wedge-shaped objects in China. Lightning striking ground near wedge-shaped object in Scotland. Lightning striking ground near wedge-shaped object in Central Africa. Coincidence in France. Coincidence in Java. Coincidence in South America. We grant a great deal, but not a tendency to restlessness. Nevertheless, this is the psychotropism of science to all thunderstones said to have fallen luminously. As to greenstone, it is in the island of Jamaica where the notion is general that axes of a hard greenstone fall from the sky during the rains. Journal of the Institute of Jamaica, 2-4. Some other time we shall inquire into this localization of objects of a specific material. They are of a stone nowhere else to be found in Jamaica. Notes and Queries, 2-8-24. In my own tendency to exclude, or in the attitude of one peasant or savage who thinks he is not to be classed with other peasants or savages, I am not very much impressed with what natives think. It would be hard to tell why. If the word of a Lord Kelvin carries no more weight upon a scientific subject than the word of a Sitting Bull, unless it be in agreement with conventional opinion, I think it must be because savages have bad table manners. However, my snobbishness in this respect loosens up somewhat before very widespread beliefs by savages and peasants, and the notion of thunderstones is as wide as geography itself. The natives of Burma, China, Japan, according to Blinkenberg, Thunder Weapons, page 100, not of course that Blinkenberg accepts one word of it, think that carved stone objects have fallen from the sky, because they think they have seen such objects fall from the sky. Such objects are called thunderbolts in these countries. They are called thunderstones in Moravia, Holland, Belgium, France, Cambodia, Sumatra, and Siberia. They are called storm stones in Lausitz, sky arrows in Slavonia, thunder axes in England and Scotland, lightning stones in Spain and Portugal, sky axes in Greece, lightning flashes in Brazil, thunder teeth in Ambonia. The belief is as widespread as is belief in ghosts and witches, which only the superstitious deny today. As to beliefs by North American Indians, Tyler gives a list of references, Primitive Culture 2-237. As to South American Indians, certain stone hatchets are said to have fallen from the heavens. Journal of American Folklore, 17-203. If you too revolt against coincidence after coincidence after coincidence, but find our interpretation of thunderstones just a little too strong or rich for digestion, we recommend the explanation of one Tallius, written in 1649. The naturalists say they are generated in the sky by fulgurous exhalation conglobed in a cloud by the circumfused humor. Of course, the paper in the Cornhill Magazine was written with no intention of trying really to investigate this subject, but to deride the notion that worked stone objects have ever fallen from the sky. A writer in the American Journal of Science, 1/21/325, read this paper and thinks it remarkable that any man of ordinary reasoning powers should write a paper to prove that thunderbolts do not exist. I confess that we're a little flattered by that, over and over. It is scarcely necessary to suggest to the intelligent reader that thunderstones are a myth. We contend that there is a misuse of a word here. We admit that only we are intelligent upon this subject, if by intelligence is meant the inquiry of inequilibrium, and that all other intellection is only mechanical reflex. Of course that intelligence too is mechanical, but less orderly and confined, less obviously mechanical. That as an acceptance of ours becomes firmer and firmer established, we pass from the state of intelligence to reflexes and ruts. An odd thing is that intelligence is usually supposed to be credible. It may be in the sense that it is mental activity trying to find out, but it is confession of ignorance. The bees, the theologians, the dogmatic scientists are the intellectual aristocrats. The rest of us are plebeians, not yet graduated to nirvana, or to the instinctive and suave as differentiated from the intelligent and crude. Blinkenberg gives many instances of the superstition of thunderstones, which flourishes only where mentality is in a lamentable state, or universally. In Malacca, Sumatra, and Java, natives say that stone axes have often been found under trees that have been struck by lightning. Blinkenberg does not dispute this, but says it is coincidence, that the axes were of course upon the ground in the first place, that the natives jumped to the conclusion that these carved stones had fallen in or with lightning. In Central Africa, it is said that often have wedge-shaped, highly polished objects of stone described as axes been found sticking in trees that have been struck by lightning, or what seemed to be lightning. The natives, rather like the unscientific persons of Memphis, Tennessee, when they saw snakes after a storm, jumped to the conclusion that the axes had not always been sticking in the trees. Livingstone, Last Journal, pages 83, 89, 442, 448, says that he had never heard of stone implements used by natives of Africa. A writer in the report of the Smithsonian Institution, 1877, 308, says that there are a few, that they are said by the natives to have fallen in thunderstorms. As to luminosity, it is my lamentable acceptance that bodies falling through this earth's atmosphere, if not warmed even, often fall with a brilliant light, looking like flashes of lightning. This matter seems important. We'll take it up later, with data. In Prussia, 2 stone axes were found in the trunks of trees, one under the bark. Blinkenberg, Thunder Weapons, page 100. The finders jumped to the conclusion that the axes had fallen there. Another stone axe, or wedge-shaped object of worked stone, said to have been found in a tree that had been struck by something that looked like lightning. Thunder Weapons, page 71. The finder jumped to the conclusion. Story told by Blinkenberg of a woman who lived near Kilsberg in Sweden, who found a flint near an old willow, near her house. I emphasize near her house because that means familiar ground. The willow had been split by something. She jumped. Cow killed by lightning, or by what looked like lightning, Isle of Sark near Guernsey. The peasant who owned the cow dug up the ground at the spot and found a small greenstone axe. Blinkenberg says that he jumped to the conclusion that it was this object that had fallen luminously, killing the cow. Reliquary, 1867, 208. A flint axe found by a farmer, after a severe storm, described as a fearful storm, by a signal staff, which had been split by something. I should say that nearness to a signal staff may be considered familiar ground. Whether he jumped, or arrived at the conclusion by a more leisurely process, the farmer thought that the flint object had fallen in the storm. In this instance, we have a lamentable scientist with us. It's impossible to have positive difference between orthodoxy and heresy. Somewhere there must be a merging into each other, or an overlapping. Nevertheless, upon such a subject as this, it does seem a little shocking. In most works upon meteorites, the peculiar sulphurous odor of things that fall from the sky is mentioned. Sir John Evans, Stone Implements, page 57, says, with extraordinary reasoning powers, if he could never have thought such a thing with ordinary reasoning powers, that this flint object proved to have been the bolt by its peculiar smell when broken. If it did so prove to be, that settles the whole subject. If we prove that only one object of worked stone has fallen from the sky, all piling up of further reports is unnecessary. However, we have already taken the stand that nothing settles anything, that the disputes of ancient Greece are no nearer solution now than they were several thousand years ago. all because, in a positive sense, there is nothing to prove or settle or solve. Our object is to be more nearly real than our opponents. Wideness is an aspect of the universal. We go on widely. According to us, the fat man is nearer godliness than is the thin man. Eat, drink, and approximate to the positive absolute. Beware of negativeness, by which we mean indigestion. The vast majority of thunderstones are described as axes, but Mornier, La Nature, 1892, 381, tells us of one that was in his possession, said to have fallen at Gardia, Algeria, contrasting profondément, pear-shaped, with the angular outlines of ordinary meteorites. The conventional explanation that it had been formed as a drop of molten matter from a larger body seems reasonable to me, but with less agreeableness I note its fall in a thunderstorm, the datum that turns the orthodox meteorologist pale with rage, or induces a slight elevation of his eyebrows if you mention it to him. Mornier tells of another thunderstone said to have fallen in North Africa. Mornier, too, is a little lamentable here. He quotes a soldier of experience that such objects fall most frequently in the deserts of Africa. Rather miscellaneous now. Thunderstone said to have fallen in London, April, 1876, weight about 8 pounds, no particulars as to shape. Tim's Yearbook, 1877 246. Thunderstone said to have fallen at Cardiff, September 26, 1916. London Times, September 28, 1916. According to Nature, 98-95, it was coincidence, only a lightning flash had been seen. Stone that fell in a storm near St. Albans, England, accepted by the Museum of St. Albans, said at the British Museum not to be of true meteoritic material. Nature, 80-34. London Times, April 26, 1876. That April 20th, 1876, near Wolverhampton, fell a mass of meteoritic iron during a heavy fall of rain. An account of this phenomenon in Nature, 14-272, by H.S. Maskelyne, who accepts it as authentic. Also, see Nature 13-531. For 3 other instances, see the Scientific American, 47-194, 52-83, 68-325. As to wedge-shaped larger than could very well be called an axe, Nature, 3300. That May 27, 1884, at Tisnes, Norway, a meteorite had fallen, that the turf was torn up at the spot where the object had been supposed to have fallen, that 2 days later a very peculiar stone was found nearby. The description is, in shape and size, very like the 4th part of a large Stilton cheese. It is our acceptance that many objects and different substances have been brought down by atmospheric disturbance, from what, only as a matter of convenience now and until we have more data, we call the Super Sargasso Sea. However, our chief interest is in objects that have been shaped by means similar to human handicraft. Description of the thunderstones of Burma, Proceedings of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, 1869, 183, said to be of a kind of stone unlike any other found in Burma, called thunderbolts by the natives. I think there's a good deal of meaning in such expressions as unlike any other found in Burma, but that if they had said anything more definite, there would have been unpleasant consequences to writers in the 19th century. More about the thunderstones of Burma in the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquities of London, 2-3-97. One of them, described as an adze, was exhibited by Captain Duff, who wrote that there was no stone like it in its neighborhood. Of course, it may not be very convincing to say that because a stone is unlike neighboring stones it had foreign origin. Also, we fear it is a kind of plagiarism. We got it from the geologists, who demonstrate by this reasoning the foreign origin of erratics. We fear we're a little gross and scientific at times. But it's my acceptance that a great deal of scientific literature must be read between the lines. It's not everyone who has the lamentableness of Sir John Evans. Just as a great deal of Voltaire's meaning was interlinear, we suspect that a Captain Duff merely hints rather than to risk having a Professor Lawrence Smith fly at him and call him a half-insane man. Whatever Captain Duff's meaning may have been, and whether he smiled like a Voltaire when he wrote it, Captain Duff writes of the extremely soft nature of the stone, rendering it equally useless as an offensive or defensive weapon. Story by a correspondent in Nature, 3453, of a Malay of considerable social standing. And one thing about our data is that, damned though they be, they do so often bring us into awful good company. Who knew of a tree that had been struck about a month before by something in a thunderstorm. He searched among the roots of this tree and found a thunderstone. Not said whether he jumped or leaped to the conclusion that it had fallen, process likely to be more leisurely in tropical countries. Also, I'm afraid his way of reasoning was not very original. Just so were fragments of the Bath furnace meteorite accepted by orthodoxy discovered. We shall now have an unusual experience. We shall read of some reports of extraordinary circumstances that were investigated by a man of science. Not, of course, that they were really investigated by him, but that his phenomena occupied a position approximating higher to real investigation than to utter neglect. Over and over we read of extraordinary occurrences. No discussion, not even a comment afterwards findable, mere mention occasionally. Burial and damnation. The extraordinary and how quickly it is hidden away. Burial and damnation, or the obscurity of the conspicuous. We did read of a man who, in the matter of snails, did travel some distance to assure himself of something that he had suspected in advance. And we remember Professor Hitchcock, who had only to smite Amherst with the wand of his botanical knowledge, and lo, 2 fungi sprung up before night. And we did read of Dr. Gray and his thousands of fishes from one pailful of water. But these instances stand out. More frequently there was no investigation. We now have a good many reported occurrences that were investigated. Of things said to have fallen from the sky, we make, in the usual scientific way, 2 divisions: miscellaneous objects and substances, and symmetric objects attributable to beings like human beings, subdividing into wedges, spheres, and disks. The Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society, 14207. That July 2, 1866, a correspondent to a London newspaper wrote that something had fallen from the sky during a thunderstorm of June 30, 1866, at Notting Hill. Mr. G.T. Symons, of Symons' Meteorologic Magazine, investigated, about as fairly and with about as unprejudiced a mind as anything ever has been investigated. He says that the object was nothing but a lump of coal, that next door to the home of the correspondent coal had been unloaded the day before. With the uncanny wisdom of the stranger upon unfamiliar ground that we have noted before, Mr. Symons saw that the coal reported to have fallen from the sky, and the coal unloaded more prosaically the day before, were identical. Persons in the neighborhood, unable to make this simple identification, had bought from the correspondent pieces of the object reported to have fallen from the sky. As to credulity, I know of no limits for it, but when it comes to paying out money for credulity, oh, no standards to judge by, of course. Just the same. The trouble with efficiency is that it will merge away into excess. With what seems to me to be superabundance of convincingness, Mr. Symons then lugs another character into his little comedy: that it was all a hoax by a chemist's pupil who had filled a capsule with an explosive and during the storm had thrown the burning mass into the gutter, so making an artificial thunderbolt. Or even Shakespeare, with all his inartistry, did not lug in King Lear to make Hamlet complete. Whether I'm lugging in something that has no special meaning myself or not, I find that this storm of June 30th, 1866, was peculiar. It is described in the London Times, July 2nd, 1866, that, during the storm, the sky in many places remained partially clear while hail and rain were falling. That may have more meaning when we take up the possible extra-mundane origin of some hailstones, especially if they fall from a cloudless sky. Mere suggestion, not worth much, that there may have been falls of extra-mundane substances in London, June 30th, 1866. Clinkers, said to have fallen during a storm at Kilburn, July 5th, 1877. According to the Kilburn Times, July 7th, 1877, quoted by Mr. Symons, a street had been literally strewn during the storm with a mass of clinkers, estimated at about 2 bushels, sizes from that of a walnut to that of a man's hand. Pieces of the clinkers can be seen at the Kilburn Times office. If these clinkers, or cinders, were refuse from one of the super-mercantile constructions from which coke and coal and ashes occasionally fall to this earth, or rather to the super-Sargasso Sea, from which dislodgment by tempests occurs, it is intermediastic to accept that they must merge away somewhere with local phenomena of the scene of precipitation. If a red-hot stove should drop from a cloud into Broadway, someone would find that, at about the time of the occurrence, a moving van had passed, and that the moving men had tired of the stove or something, that it had not been really red hot, but it had been rouged instead of blacked by some absent-minded housekeeper. Compared with some of the scientific explanations that we have encountered, there's considerable restraint, I think, in that one. Mr. Symons learned that in the same street, he emphasizes that it was a short street, there was a fire engine station. I had such an impression of him, hustling and bustling around at Notting Hill, searching cellars until he found one with newly arrived coal in it, ringing doorbells, exciting a whole neighborhood, calling up to second-story windows, stopping people in the streets, hotter and hotter on the trail of a wretched impostor of a chemist's pupil. After his efficiency at Notting Hill, we'd expect to hear that he went to the station and something like this: "It is said that clinkers fell in your street at about 10 minutes past 4 o'clock, afternoon of July 5th. Will you look over your records and tell me where your engine was at about 10 minutes past 4, July 5th?" Mr. Symons says, "I think that most probably they had been raked out of the steam fire engine." June 20th, 1880, it was reported that a thunderstone had struck the house at 180 Oakley Street, Chelsea, falling down the chimney into the kitchen grate. Mr. Symons investigated. He describes the thunderstone as an agglomeration of brick, soot, unburned coal, and cinder. He says that, in his opinion, lightning had flashed down the chimney and had fused some of the brick of it. He does think it remarkable that the lightning did not then scatter the contents of the grate, which were disturbed only as if a heavy body had fallen. If we admit that climbing up the chimney to find out is too rigorous a requirement for a man who may have been large, dignified, and subject to expansions, the only unreasonableness we find in what he says, as judged by our more modern outlook, is, "I suppose that no one would suggest that bricks are manufactured in the atmosphere." Sounds a little unreasonable to us because it is so of the positivistic spirit of former times, when it was not so obvious that the highest incredibility and laughability must merge away with the proper, as a Scientific American supplement would say. The preposterous is always interpretable in terms of the proper, with which it must be continuous. Or, clay-like masses, such as have fallen from the sky, tremendous heat generated by their velocity, they bake bricks. We begin to suspect that Mr. Symons exhausted himself at Notting Hill. It's a warning to efficiency fanatics. End of Chapter 8A. Recording by Acacia Wood.